White House senior counselor for trade and manufacturing Peter Navarro says the administration is moving to make beef affordable again. They're going after the big four packers, dubbing them the beef cartel, which Navarro says is tied to Brazil, and that a Brazil-China axis has a lot to do with the price of your beef. Joining us to discuss is Marcos Schotgues, editor-in-chief for the Epoch Times Brazil and Latin America correspondent for Epoch Times USA. So, Marcos, you've reported on Brazil and China's involvement in the beef industry. Can you help us understand what this, quote, beef cartel is and how it's tied to prices?
Sure. So, over 80% of US beef processing, so that's not cattle ranching, that's not the part of having the actual beef be produced, but we're talking about processing. So everything in between, having a living cow and having a hamburger or a steak, that's the processing part we're talking about. So basically, over 80% of this market, of this industry, is controlled by four companies, like Peter Navarro recently said, and two of those, it's called National Beef in the US, it's called Marfrig in Brazil, and JBS, that's very important. That's probably the most important one when we talk about an alleged cartel. So both of those control about each a market share of, depends on where you read up on it, but from 17 to about even 25 or 35% each, depends on the year, but it's something around there. And you can obviously see how big that is, and that can influence prices a lot. We can go into more detail on this, but it's worth saying that while National Beef has not been as involved in corruption scandals, both have been very highly exposed to China. And when we talk JBS, we're talking about a company that's commanded by two brothers who have previously actually confessed to corruption involving about a little under 2,000 politicians in Brazil for favorable market conditions, and both highly exposed to China. So that's basically the structure of this so-called cartel Navarro was talking about.
So if, according to you, this cartel controls such a significant portion of the market share, how much more expensive is this cartel making beef in the US?
Right, so let's go basically through the logic here. If you have less companies processing the food, this means less competition, and this can make it easier for these companies to actually form a cartel, meaning they could just agree on prices with each other, and this leaves competition out. And because they're so big, they can eventually take in the losses if the market fluctuates. And like Navarro said in his recently op-ed in the Washington Examiner, this can create an industry bottleneck. And also, of course, when we talk about such a huge market as producing beef and processing beef, we're of course also talking about the risk there for corruption. Anywhere you have a cartel like the OPEC, which deals with oil internationally, and is essentially a cartel, you're talking about a group of countries that can agree on prices. They can basically use that as leverage geopolitically. Now think about that when we're talking food, right? And that implicates not only markets, but also food security. So basically, how does that make, and how much does it make, how much more expensive does that make beef in your dinner table? It's hard to tell precisely a number, but what we can say is that under this umbrella, you can clearly see how this can create conditions for a small group of companies to essentially tell prices to ranchers and to retailers.
So you bring up food security, and the Trump administration considers that an issue of national security. So, and earlier you also mentioned ties to China. So putting that together, right, what does this level of foreign control and influence over American beef mean for national security in the US?
Right, so this is where Navarro's take gets really interesting when we talk about foreign policy and national security, because this is not an issue that only affects the domestic market. It's not only about ranchers getting a fair price when they try to process their beef. This is also a broader issue, because you're talking about, when you talk about Brazil specifically, or Brazilian companies that deal with foreign markets and export to China. Let's just try to understand the magnitude of what we're talking about here first, right? So when you take JBS, when you take these Brazilian companies, China is their #1 buyer of beef. China imports a huge quantity of their beef. We're talking percentages in the double digits from Brazil, and JBS basically controls a very large part of those efforts. If you take National Beef, or as it's called again in Brazil, Marfrig, alongside that, you're talking about a very large portion of the entirety of beef that's imported into China coming from these Brazilian companies. When you add to that one of these companies was involved in the car wash scandal, which was eventually called by the DOJ in the United States one of the largest foreign bribery scandals in the history of the world. Of course, there are different parts of it. They weren't talking specifically about JBS when they said that, but they were part of the same investigation. So you're talking about these companies which determine a large part of the price of meat in the United States having this huge exposure to China. And one of these companies has previously been part of major corruption scandals, including bribes to about 2,000 elected officials in Brazil. So you see the potential for this to be involved in racketeering, for this to be involved in market manipulation, and for China to be able to also have leverage there. Add to that while we can't jump to conclusions here, we can't make vague accusations, but what we can say is that Joesley Batista, the head of JBS, it's controlled by two brothers, Wesley Batista and Joesley Batista. So Joesley has previously been involved reportedly on negotiations on Venezuela as well, on behalf of U.S. envoys. Of course, all of that is only reported, but it suffices to say this is a man who has done heavy lobbying in the U.S. before. When you take that whole web of connections, we can basically only speculate about it, but you can see that what we can say is that conditions are there for corruption to happen where corruption has happened before, and China can have leverage in that.
Okay, so then I want to ask you, because you talked about the level of influence that China has, its involvement in this industry. I mean, I'm sure this didn't happen overnight. How did we get here then?
I mean, how did we get here? So a part of this is basically China gaining geopolitical leverage in Brazil. China has basically replaced the United States as Brazil's largest trading partner in 2009. And Brazil, of course, has this huge food sector. JBS is basically the largest food processor in the world. When we talk beef, the United States and Brazil often compete for first place on who's the larger producer and exporter. When we talk about soybeans, when we talk about iron ore and other commodities, but let's stay in food. When we talk about commodities, China is a huge importer. And China's market share in Brazil, when we talk about exports, has grown to the point where basically they get to tell, and there has been many cases reported of this, right? They get to tell the rules of the Brazilian beef industry. As leverage rises, and as we see JBS taking a large market share, this exposure starts to grow on. We can talk also about the scenario where, like I said, JBS has, and they confessed, this was a confession by JBS head Joesley Batista. Basically, JBS bribed a little under 2,000 public officials to get illicit advantages. This happened as China grew its market share in Brazil, grew its imports of meat. JBS was using corruption to basically get to a point where they could expand their market share, and both things went alongside each other. At the same time, in the United States, market conditions were ripe for lots of smaller companies to be taken over by the big conglomerates. This is the kind of thing which has been the target of antitrust lawsuits by the US administration, not this administration, but by the US government at large beforehand. When we talk about the original antitrust game and go back to Teddy Roosevelt, at the time, JP Morgan, not the bank, the man JP Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan, was going through a process called Morganization, where he would go into markets, use his huge funds to merge a bunch of companies, call it General something. So General Electric was basically a takeover of Edison Electric by JP Morgan, and then merging it with all the other small companies, right? So this is a violation of antitrust law in the United States from many angles. It could be, depends on the scenario. But basically, JBS, National Beef, and not only the Brazil companies, but Cargill and the other ones involved in these allegations, saw the opportunity to basically pull this off, go in with thin margins, but large purchasing power, and take over those markets. And when we talk the JBS case specifically, China taking over market share in Brazil, corruption scandals allowing JBS to grow, and an opportunity to modernize in the US market. So all of these walk together to the point where we are at now, where over 80% of the market is controlled by about 4 beef processing companies.
Okay, great explanation. Just real quick, one final thing. What are the steps that the U.S. can do to be rock solid on its food security and its beef industry?
Right, so when we talk food security, being really brief, of course, you want to diversify your sources and have at least some internal supply. With beef processing, there's much that can be done, but first things first, antitrust, diversification, a larger number of companies operating, and a large number of countries holding these companies, and preferably a large amount of companies being held by basically the United States or US citizens. So when we talk food security, those would be the first steps. Of course, it's nuanced, but briefly, that's about it.
Okay, Marcos, always good to talk to you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.